I need our pastor outers, as Mom calls them, to take out these white sheets here. They're about 8 pages long, and pass them out as soon as you can. And while you guys are doing that, I'm going to go ahead and run through some slides here that are just supposed to be intro, because I know you guys would think, well, he's just going to come heavy and then probably put us to sleep in about 5 minutes. So I wanted to kind of start light and give you a moment to catch up and all that. So, first of all, let's go a slide down. Mom covered some definitions. She talked about justification, and she talked about it as being an act of God. So the only thing I wanted to stress from that is the courtroom concept that God declares us righteous. But friends, when we get saved, when He declares us righteous, He doesn't leave you in your sins. Right? He actually makes you righteous. He wouldn't call you righteous if you're not made righteous as well. So let's go to the next slide. See, our Calvinist brethren, they'll tell you that Jesus is nothing more than a pair of binoculars that God looks through to see us terrible, rotten, sinning Christians as holy. And so when Jesus died on the cross, now He is those binoculars which God looks through to see us as holy. But really, if He removed those binoculars, we're still the same thing. Friends, that's not the truth. The truth is you are literally changed. You are made like Him in nature. You begin to be like Him more and more from that point. We can keep going. These are just parts, regeneration and adoption. They're parts of the same thing, different words for being saved. Go back one. Now, entire sanctification, I took this out of the manual. I kind of put it in my own words. It's the instantaneous. That's the big point of what we're going to be sharing about all through this session and the next one that I'll be doing later. It's the instantaneous act of God following when you're saved, and it's different from it in a big way, in which He destroys the sin nature, which is the bent that Mom was talking about, to want to sin, or the desire to sin from your heart. He performs this deeper change by filling or baptizing believers with the Holy Spirit. It's the natural state of your heart from that point is one characterized by total obedience to God. And you're filled with perfect love. All right? Go ahead. Now, when we say crisis, I'm not talking about sometimes we use it in a different way. We mean like a tragedy. I'm in a crisis, or I'm crunched, or something's about to happen that's bad. Crisis in our terminology means that God does His work. It's His work. It's not our work. We can't do it. It's something of divine origin, and it also means that He saves us or sanctifies us instantaneously. That's what we're emphasizing when we say the word crisis. But there's also gradual work that goes before it and that comes after it. Here's Wesley on the issue. He says, a man may be dying for some time, yet he does not, properly speaking, die till the soul is separated from the body. And in that instant, he lives the life of eternity. Go ahead. In like manner, after justification, he may be dying to sin for some time, yet he is not dead to sin till sin is separated from his soul. And in that instant, there it is, the crisis. So we're looking at the process in crisis here. He lives the full life of love. So there's a gradual approach to the crisis, and then boom, this big transformation God does in your life. And then as a change is undergone when the body dies, is of a different kind and infinitely greater than any we had known before, yea, such as till then it is impossible to conceive. So the change wrought when the soul dies to sin is of a different kind and infinitely greater than any before. So you've never experienced this just because you were saved. This is something much deeper, all right? And then any conceive till he experiences it, yet he still grows in grace, in the knowledge of Christ, in the love and image of God, and will do so not only till death, but to all eternity. Now here's the fun part. I was given these at the beginning when I was first trying to understand sanctification myself. When we're born in this world, we're a lot like a tree. We have the sins of our lives right on the outside. We swear, we cuss, we cheat, we steal, we lie, and we really aren't ashamed of it. And so I put it as a tree when we're not saved. Then when Jesus comes, when we ask Him into our heart, we ask Him to save us, what He does is He, just like Paul Bunyan's doing there, and he's about that big, God hauls off and cuts down that fruit of our lives, that sin that we've committed and that we're not ashamed of, we've become ashamed of, and He washes it all away, gives us power over those outward acts. But friends, notice the trunk, the root, still remains. And so what happens when you get sanctified is God has to pull the roots, the nature to sin out of you. And that's what that last scene is when you get sanctified. Go ahead. And then over here, this is another concept. This is in relationship to lost people. You see, when you're unsaved, you're just swimming in an endless sea of sin. You're hopelessly lost, okay? And then when Jesus saves you, you can picture it like a lifesaver around you. Because why? Because half of you is under sin, and half of you is living above sin. And friends, if somebody comes over to try to hold on to you, another sinner, most of the time they'll find you at one of those points when you're down, and what happens is they'll take you right down with them, okay? So friends, when you get sanctified, you're up on top of a rock. You can picture it like that, or you can picture it like we're in a boat, pulling people out of the water because we're living entirely above sin. Go ahead. Now this one I drew up. This is the old man, and he's fighting. And then God comes, and when you get saved, he punches him and knocks all the wind out of him, and he goes and he takes a seat in your heart, and he rocks back and forth for a while because he's exhausted, but pretty soon he tries to start fighting God's will again in your life. If you don't get sanctified, he'll stand back up and fight, so God has to kick him right out of your heart. And that's what happens when you get sanctified holy, okay? All right, we can go to the next. Here it is again, same concept. There he is fighting before you get saved. You're just fighting God's will, then you get knocked out when you get saved, but it's going to come back if you don't get kicked out the door. That's what it is to get sanctified. All right. Now we're going to part 1. All right, this one now, friends, this subject, like Mom said, I love it. And Jeremy said he kind of broke my thought yesterday. I was sitting there, and Jeremy never says anything, and for a long time, and all of a sudden when Jeremy says something, he really means what he says. And Jeremy just all of a sudden out of nowhere goes, Ben, you've been working on that for 3 straight weeks. And it kind of hit me, and I was like, yeah. Oh, yeah, I've been zoned out. Well, anyway. Okay, go ahead. We're going to talk about the divergence after Wesley, how Methodism, early Methodism, which is our grandparents, our church that we've come from, how they moved away from Wesley not long after he died, and how they weren't faithful on the issue of holiness. Now, these were some objectives I wanted to give before you. I wanted you to be able to, by the time we're done, know the parameters. Know when somebody's trying to take you away from what you believe when we're talking about sanctification. Know just by key words and concepts like that what they're trying to do. Go ahead. And also, I wanted to speak to the heart. That's what that last one is. Not just tell you about it up here for your head's sake. I want to talk to you about it so that you can experience it in your heart and life. Here's some themes that we'll be covering. I'm not going to spend any time on it because I'm trying to rush. I've got too much going here. All right. Now that paper that you have in front of you, it's long and involved. And I tried to break it down. But friends, I mean, you got to be thankful to me because otherwise you can read it in here. And so, that's pretty good that I broke it down that far. Now, what happened is this, Olive M. Winchester, she wrote an awesome book. And it's an old-timer book in the Church of Nazarene. She was a professor, and she had an awesome point. If you want to prove people that sanctification is in the Bible, in the New Testament, looking at the Greek language, you have to look at the aorist tense. The aorist tense signifies a crisis. And it's most of the time talking about momentary action. Now, I know that there's been a rejection of that concept in our day. Matter of fact, since 1981, I mean, friends, really honestly, I could go down the board and tell you how our culture today, and we're going to get there later, but it's breaking down every rock that my faith stood on when I started. I mean, Phineas Bressee's common experience of holiness that just brought my heart to fire when I read about it. His experience of sanctification, our church founder, they've minimized to nothing but lightning that he saw one night. And then we keep going, and this author that wrote against her, Randy Maddox, which I put in here, I think he's United Methodist, but anyway, he wrote against this concept, and since 1981, the first professor that ever stood up in front of me at school, in our schools, he stood in front of me and he said to the whole class, the aorist tense does not signify a crisis experience. That's been misinterpreted. He went on and on. Well, friends, that's the biggest proof we have in the New Testament, that you can be sanctified in a crisis experience. Now, I want to tell you the main crux of what I've written in this paper is on page 3, if you flip over. That big part, it's page 3, and it's the big letters. It says, here is the error in his logic, Maddox's logic. The usage of the aorist, it's a tense of a verb that we're talking about in the Greek, he wants to use to provide us with its primary function. So he's trying to tell us how it functions. It is the one that most often appears with a reference to time. Friends, the aorist tense, aorist, the word means undefined. And it's speaking about in relationship to time. And so if you say it's always in relationship to the past, that we're going to try to explain to you what the undefined tense means, you're already goofing up, okay? You're taking it out of its proper function and then trying to explain it to everybody as though that's its main function. In order to understand it, you have to move outside of the indicative mood. You have to move outside of it and look at how it functions out of relationship to time, and then you'll see what the aorist tense is all about. The aorist tense, always outside of the indicative, it has to do with an instantaneous crisis. Now, there's 3 different kinds. So we can go ahead and skip down, Amanda. Keep going. Now, here it is. The first one is ingressive. And it's only every time that we're talking about it, like when Jesus said in John chapter 17, he says, sanctify them by the truth. He's not saying, it's the same concept as you must be born again to enter the kingdom of heaven. He's not saying be born again and born again and born again. He's saying you must experience this once. And this is a radical transformation that will bring you into the state I want you to be in, and then you'll be my person, okay? Now, it starts, when we're talking about ingressive, that concept of the aorist, it's always the beginning point. That's all it stresses. The second one is the effective, which is an end point. So you're saying you're done with sin. I give you an example later on where he says, don't you know that we are done with sin? There's this scripture that talks about how we are finished with sin. And so he's talking about in relationship to regeneration. When you're saved, there's a sense in which we've stopped sinning. And so that's an emphasis on the end of something. And so again, it's instantaneous. Okay? And those two always refer to crisis. Now the third one is what Maddox is all about. He says, guys, it's not about crisis. We're going to go back into the Bible and we're going to read process into it. And believe me, he's done that. He has taken every single reference to the crisis and he has undone it. And what he says by the end of it is really it never can be stand on its own and tell you that there's a crisis in the New Testament. He says rather there's this one form of the aorist called the constitutive. We might as well just call it process aorist. It's talking about a whole period of time that took a long time, but it's talking about it as a whole. And so he says, so we can just take that one function of the aorist and just kind of push it over all the rest of them, and so now there's no crisis. Well, friends, in order to do that, guess where the constitutive appears? The constitutive always appears in relationship to time in the past because it has a little augment on it. And so instead of being undefined like the aorist should be, instead of doing that, it is something entirely opposite and is contrary to the function of the aorist. He's taking something that's not aorist except in statement, and he's defining the aorist by it. And so he has totally undone himself in doing that. That is the logic of that little pink book I put over here. And so we can go on ahead and move from that. But I'd like you to take your time and read those arguments that I brought against him. He says that no scholars support that anymore. Ralph Earl, leading Greek theologian, supported this version, the understanding of the concept of the aorist. All right, we can go ahead. I just put these things up here. We don't need that. We'll just keep moving. Keep moving. Keep moving. Keep moving. Keep moving. We've covered it. Okay, that's where we're at. Now, I'm going to shift pages. No more grammar, no more Greek. Okay, we're going to go into the history. Now, friends, that was the Bible. I wanted to take something from the Bible to show you. That's our strongest point. Okay, but let's go ahead into the history now of the Methodist Church. Now, I want to show you that John Wesley believed in sanctification this way from the start. He taught 2 distinct works of grace. You're saved and then you're sanctified. And entire sanctification was preceded, as I said before, it was led up to by a gradual work and then followed by a gradual work as well. And he laid that down in 1733. Now, friends, right after him, there's a person named John Fletcher, and he basically, they call him second to Wesley and Wesleyan understanding in Methodism, and he held to Wesley's version. That's all I'm trying to tell you here. Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, the ones that brought this version of Wesley's teaching over to America, they stuck to John Wesley on those issues. Okay? We can keep going. Here's Wesley. That Christian perfection is that love of God and our neighbor, which implies deliverance from all sin, that this is received merely by faith. You see, friends, if God wants you just to choose and believe by faith, then the only concept that you can have of sanctification is that it's instantaneous. I mean, he has to respond to your faith, or else he's just laughing at you after you've believed. So the moment you believe, God's not going to laugh at you. He changes your heart, okay? And it's instantaneous, all right? That is given instantaneously in one moment, that we are to expect it not at death, but every moment. That now is the accepted time. Now is the day of this salvation. Go ahead. Now, going into Wesley's understanding of original sin, I'm not going to read you all these things on most of this stuff. I want you to understand, Wesley did not stress only that we lost relationship to God. Wesley stressed a actual corruption, okay? When he talked about original sin, we are ugly when it comes to the things of God after we have been born in this world. And let me explain it. In order to get rotten eggs, I preach this, in order to get rotten eggs in a refrigerator, it's not just the fact that you unplug the refrigerator. That doesn't just automatically result in rotten eggs, okay? In order to get rotten eggs, that's the source of the problem, is that you've unplugged the refrigerator. But in order for you to get rotten eggs, the temperature has to raise. And then they have to decompose, okay? They have to turn nasty. Now, friends, when we got unplugged from God, we turned inward. We became totally selfish. That's what we're all about, okay? Wesley really described it, and we'll get to that later. Go ahead. But he was in a controversy all his life for his stand on original sin, being destroyed in this lifetime. People attacked him about it because they don't want to deal with the fact that they have that nature. See, friends, if you're not been sanctified, this is one point I wanted to really make, then you have a tendency in you to be a holiness opposer. You know, everybody in here was born a holiness opposer. I was a holiness opposer at one point. Nobody wants to succumb to God's will in their life. Nobody just wants to say, yes, Lord. It's hard. And it's going to take a God change in order for you to say, yes, sir. Okay, keep going. Now, here's some of the pictures of the people that were faithful to Wesley, Coke and Asbury. Go ahead. Now, for the first 65 years, Methodism was faithful, okay? But just till 1840. And Wesley died in 1791, okay? Not long afterwards, they fell away. And we're going to kind of trace that, all right? Go back one. Now, this is one of the major three theologians that is brought up in this book here. Theological Transition in American Methodism. He has it out there. I'm going to take it from this one I borrowed from the school. But anyway, from 1790 to 1935, Robert Childs, who is a Methodist, he wrote in there how there has been a transition in American Methodism. And he takes three guys to sum it all up. Watson's one of them. Now, friends, I'm not saying if you read Watson, he's going to totally mess you all up. But I'll tell you one thing. He changed his emphasis. Adam Clark, who was right after Wesley, taught crisis and stressed it. But Watson came along and he decided that he was going to change his stresses. And when he did so, he laid down a foundation that's led to corruption in American society. And I want to explain it to you. First of all, he stressed that original sin is just a loss of relationship. I just told you that's not enough. He didn't go far enough. Wesley had not said that. Wesley said it was corruption, absolute corruption, okay? And then on top of that, he started to say, well, let's just push gradual. Push gradual. Now, he was a major Methodist thinker. Go ahead, keep going. Keep going. Basically, they're saying the same thing. Keep going. All right. Now, Metz summarizes the shift from there to where we are in the Church of the Nazarene. Metz is a Nazarene. He's one of the only traditional holiness theologians in our church right now that is still stressing what we believe. He's still alive. The other two that have really were stressing it, Taylor and Grider, have just passed away. And so kind of we're losing that last generation, those that are holding the flow, okay? But he was one that did this. Now look at how he connects it. He's summarizing all I'm going to say to you today in that one quote there. He says, early followers of Wesley described original sin in terms of a positive corruption. You know, we are wanting to sin. A constituent aspect of human nature as we know it. Later Methodists, here's where they shifted, tended to regard deprivation or that corruption he just talked about as a result only of a deprivation. Well, that's a true statement. But they stressed loss of relationship. And they threw out the need to talk about what's resulting from that we are corrupt, a condition of our heart to do wrong. And so he says there's a shift. And then he says some modern interpreters of Wesley, and later he calls them Neo-Wesleyans, some modern interpreters of Wesley refer to original sin as a perverted relationship. That's all we've summarized sin today. I can show you great men in our church even today who have turned to just start talking about sin as only a loss of relationship. Go ahead. That's just a smaller guy that followed. Watson made his stuff popular. Go ahead. He was a smaller guy too. But what he did is that he said it's an option. You can get sanctified by a crisis or by growing into it. It doesn't really matter. Okay? Yes, it does.